watch several television shows, and oftentimes a theme of many mysteries is going to be where somebody murders someone because they're wanting that person's insurance money or the family money or whatever it may be. Kind of a common theme in a lot of shows that you watch. And I don't mind watching that whenever it's when it's fiction. But I see just too often, especially when there's a death in the family, the mom and dad pass, and the siblings come together and they start trying to divide up what their parents have left. And it seems like more often than not, it seems as if the family is pulled apart. And there are siblings that will no longer speak to each other after all of that is done. And to me, after seeing it happen time and time again in other people's families, it grieves my heart to see it. Well, my name is Richard Coleman, and I'm the pastor at Shepherd Church of the Nazarene in Lexington, South Carolina, and it's great to spend just a few moments with you today. Been looking at James. James is talking to the Christian church. He's not talking to worldly people that don't know Christ. He's talking about forgiven people that are supposedly living for God every day. And he's trying to let them know some practical things that might help them in their life. And so he starts out and he says, what causes a quarrel? And then he answers his question. And he says, it's evil desires. He tells us, he said, people are plotting, scheming, I think is the word that he used, to get things that really ought not be theirs. Trying to come up with a plan so they can get something more than they should have, to kind of get something up on their fellow person. And he said, the reason that we would do that, and remember, he's talking to Christians here. He said, the reason that we would do that is so that we did not have to depend on God. And James is saying, if there's something that we need, or even something that we desire, we need to turn to God with that. Now, it's true, just because we ask God for it, it doesn't mean He's going to let us have it. There are some things that God knows we are better without. But James is saying all this quarreling and fighting and trying to get something that you really ought not have to start with, he says it's because you're not depending on God. That's thought-provoking. And he said, basically, we need to make a choice as Christians. Do we want God's will to be done in our life? Or do we want it to be our will? Is a battle going on in your life where you're constantly pulling back and forth? I know God probably wants me to do this, but I would rather do that. And we have that constant struggle back and forth in our life. It can be a miserable thing. Please pay attention. James is not talking to the world. He's talking to Christians. There's this really big church word. It's called sanctification. The concept of sanctification in a Christian's life is where we come to the place where we recognize that struggle between us and God. I want this, but God says this is what you ought to do, and we're constantly struggling, and we can become miserable Christians during that struggle. And what God wants us to do, He wants us to surrender to Him. And when we surrender to Him and we start depending upon Him, then we find out that these quarrels and the tension and all the things that can be such a struggle for us is not near the problem that it used to be whenever we allow God's will to be done. James ends this little part by, it's really kind of a famous verse that he writes, said, "Come close to God and He will come close to you. In other words, if we do our part and we turn to Him and we say, God, I want your will to be done, then things start happening in our life to show us that God is really the one that's calling the shots, and it just makes life better. Well, may the Lord bless you and keep you. May His face shine upon you. May you truly be able to walk in God's light throughout this week. Thanks for taking the time and viewing today.